we have a pretty big needle to pass through here.
Yeah.
And a roughly 10 to 20 years, it can be a little loosey-goosey based on what happens with the monetary system and the Fed in that time. But in that decade of time, the United States will go back to having what we would consider a more stable capital structure. And at the same time, when you get into the 2040s, the labor market will start reconstituting based on normal demographic factors, because the millennials' kids will then be entering the workforce. We'll be through this long winter of the Zoomers. But no one else gets to do that. Everyone else went through industrialization and urbanization either faster or more intensely than the United States did. A couple exceptions, but only a couple. And so for them, they're looking at labor markets getting smaller every year and the capital supply getting smaller every year. And still in this decade, their advanced worker cadre, that big, giant last generation, moves into retirement. So their need for government spending to keep those people alive skyrockets and never drops.
And that is very problematic for places like China, Japan, Russia, et cetera. Yeah,
I don't think China's going to survive long enough to have to wrestle with that problem, but for Japan, certainly.
Yeah, I know. That's interesting you say that, because I have never been one of these believers that China's taking over the world. I remember the kind of xenophobia that was going on with Japan was going to take over the world, and that never happened, clearly. China's got 10 years. And then it all starts to really shift, as I see it.
I think it'll be over 10 years from now.
Yeah, you really
think we're going through a shift right now.
Tell me what you mean by that. I mean, is it going to be an overthrow? I know the Chinese Communist government is very sensitive to civil unrest, right? They have huge sensitivity to that over there, and as probably they should.
Because that's how they got into power, yes.
Yeah, so what happens with China? Like, how does that unfold?
We've got some mid and long-term trends, and then there's a couple of really acute ones that are going on right now. Let's first deal with the longer-term ones. Finance doesn't work in China the way it does here. The Chinese will throw a bottomless supply of capital against anything in order to make sure that people have jobs. It doesn't matter if there's a product on the back end, really, as long as the people are working. So everything that people say about the U.S. Fed is actually true to an order of magnitude higher in China. Yeah. So the U.S. dollar is the global currency. It's the medium of exchange. It's the store of value. It's the lubricant for the number one economy and 2/3 of the top 20. The yuan is used just in China. It's not internationally traded, and they regularly expand their money supply by 5 times as much as we do. And at most times in the last 10 years, the yuan supply has been twice that of the US dollar, even though it's just not exchanged at all. So their financial system is its own thing. And to think that this is going to continue in perpetuity is being really creative with your math. They get their energy from a continental way. They don't have a navy that's capable of making that far in force in order to secure their own supply lines. Yep. So China is the country most dependent upon the U.S. Navy to keep the lights on. In manufacturing, their demographics have aged so much already that China is no longer the low-cost producer for any manufactured product. There is not a product that the Chinese make that cannot be made in North America at a lower price point. Now, you have to build the industrial plant first. So I don't mean to suggest we can flip a switch and it's all here tomorrow. Right. But it does mean that anytime there's a hiccup in the Chinese system for any reason and somebody relocates, they never go back. Because it's better with a shorter supply chain, with less energy, with less transport, with more efficient labor closer to home. There's not a sector where that doesn't work. And then in terms of industrial commodities, kind of an echo of what's going on with energy markets, they have to get it from half a world away. They can't go at it and get it themselves. They are completely dependent upon the globalized system as enforced by the American Navy. So any of these issues by themselves are country killers, independent of the demographic situation. Right. And in the short term, I think we're seeing the whole system go belly up. I think it's safe to assume that most people have relatively formed opinions about whether the COVID vaccine is the way to go or natural immunity is the way to go. But I think if we're all really being honest with ourselves, we will admit that people on the other side of that divide have some relevant points that are worth discussing. Yeah, sure. And we certainly know that if you have both, you're in better shape. Yep. Neither of those are options in China.
Mhm.
The Chinese vaccine doesn't work versus the Omicron variant, certainly not Omicron B. And because, in many ways, that the Chinese government was so successful at keeping COVID out these past 2 years, no one in China has natural immunity. So if they were to open up with Omicron B being the dominant strain, Omicron B is the most communicable virus we've ever faced, and it's the highest lethality rate of all of the COVID variants to date. If they just opened up, they'd have millions of deaths a month for at least 3 months. And in a one-man show government, that is how you bring the system down. So COVID lockdowns that affect entire cities, this is their only option for the foreseeable future. So Shanghai shut down on April 1. They reopened on June 1. They're in the process of locking down again already because Omicron is just so communicable. Masks don't stop it sufficiently. What is China if it's not a manufacturing center?
Yeah.
Because that's all they have left. And now that is leaving very, very quickly. I think Apple's the best example there. Apple is the American company that has ignored the writing on the wall the most. And every time there's been a health issue with COVID or a trade war with Trump or Bernie Sanders coming out and beating the trade drum, every time something has happened, an explosion of genocide in Xinjiang, the crackdowns in Hong Kong, they've ignored it and they've doubled down. Mm-hmm. So they are the American company most committed to China. Over 90% of their supply chains within China now. And as of last month, even they started looking for alternatives. Everyone is on their way out because China is no longer a reliable manufacturing partner.
Is Africa the next big labor market to exploit for cheap labor? I know China's got a lot of dealings in Africa, but it's so disjointed. And
first of all, China does not have many dealings in Africa. They have some infrastructure that they've built.
Yeah, and they're they're doing a lot of loans there.
Well, whenever you see the Chinese spending $12 billion on something that's only worth $3 or $4 billion, that's not investment. That's capital flight. That's some bureaucrat taking advantage of that hyper-financialized system to get some out. So when it's his time to run for the door, he already has a nest egg.
Oh, that's interesting, because the impression I got was they were trying to act like a World Bank, where
they're splashing around a lot of cash. I agree. I'm just saying that it's not in anything that would broadly be considered sound investment. Okay. Most of the infrastructure is not in places that are really of any use. I mean, if the Chinese build infrastructure in a place that hasn't had infrastructure for the last 70 years, you really got to ask yourself why there has not been infrastructure there for the last 70 years.
Someone would have done it by now.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, they are investing in some resource production zones. Absolutely. But again, they're overpaying for them. Mm-hmm. So the Chinese are doing no refining and they're doing no manufacturing in Africa. So they're actually not taking the African labor force and bringing it up a notch at all. And if they want unskilled labor, they've got that closer to home in a place like, say, Cambodia. So for Africa to kind of move up the ladder, they've got to be part of someone else's supply chain. They don't have the indigenous capacity, technology, and capital necessary to do it all by themselves. And in a world that's moving into a tighter labor market, if you're not going to relocate the labor, you're talking about using some degree of automation to help out. Yeah. Some places can do that, some places can't. But it's difficult for me to see kind of a neo-colonial manufacturing system set up to tap unskilled labor on a different continent.